Welcome, my friends, to Wild Cowboy Tales. This is where the dust of the trails meets the fire of the heart, where legends are forged with gunpowder and courage. If you love stories of the Wild West, of lone riders and the high cost of justice, I invite you to hit the subscribe button. It won't cost you a penny, but it helps keep these stories alive, stoking the campfire for all wanderers roaming this digital frontier. Now, settle in. Night is falling, and the coyotes of the prairie are raising their lonely song. This is the perfect moment for a story. A story about a woman who struck a match and an entire territory went up in flames with it. Widow of Tombstone lit a match and the whole territory burned with it. Before the fire, Abigail Finch's world was one of order and quiet joy. It was a world measured in the scent of fresh-cut lumber from her husband's carpentry shop, the crisp rustle of new calico in their modest dry goods store, and the soft, warm weight of Thomas's hand in hers as they watched the bruised purple twilight settle over Tombstone. Thomas was not a gunslinger or a lawman. He was a builder, a man whose strength was in his hands and his honest heart. He had built their small home with his own two hands, and together, they were building a life, a small island of peace in the turbulent ocean of the Arizona territory. Their store, Finch's Provisions, was their shared dream. It stood proudly on a corner of Allen Street, its windows clean, its shelves neatly stocked. For Abigail, it was more than a business, it was a sanctuary. She knew the names of every customer, the needs of every family. She was a woman of gentle smiles and quiet grace, her life a tapestry woven with simple, sturdy threads of love and community. The silver wedding band on her finger was a perfect and broken circle, a symbol of a life that felt just as complete. The trouble began, as it so often did in Tombstone, over a piece of land. A man named Cyrus Thorne, a cattle baron with a reputation as cold and hard as the iron in his soul, wanted the corner lot where their store stood. He saw it as the perfect location for a grand saloon and gambling hall, another jewel in his greedy crown. He had made Thomas an offer, an amount that was more an insult than a negotiation. Thomas, a man who valued his sweat and dreams more than a bully's coin, had politely refused. Thorne did not take refusal well. Threats followed, delivered by his hired guns, men with dead eyes and cruel smirks. The town marshal, man whose salary was paid in Thorne's gold, advised Thomas to be reasonable, but Thomas was not a man to bend. "This is ours, Abby," he had told her. "Is Joe set? We built it. We don't run." On a Tuesday, under a sky the color of a faded bruise, Cyrus Thorne decided the time for talk was over. Abigail was in the back, taking stock of a new shipment of flour, when she heard the crash of glass. It was followed by the splintering of wood and the deep, guttural laughter of men who enjoyed destruction. She ran to the front of the store to see three of Thorne's men, their faces flushed with whiskey, smashing counters and tearing goods from the shelves. Thomas emerged from his workshop, a heavy wood mallet in his hand. "Get out of my store," he said, his voice low and steady, but shaking with a rage Abigail had never seen in him. The men just left. Their leader, a brute named Jedediah Kane, stepped forward. "Thorne sends his regards," Kane sneered. "He says you're trespassing on his property." The fight was a blur of brutal and fair violence. Thomas was strong, but he was one man against three. He swung the mallet with the force of a desperate man defending his home, but they swarmed him. Abigail screamed, throwing a jar of preserves that shattered uselessly against Kane's broad back. He turned, his eyes landing on her, and his cruel smile widened. That was the mistake that cost Thomas his life. For a second, Kane was distracted, and Thomas saw an opening. He lunged, driving his shoulder into Kane's gut, sending the big man stumbling back. But as he did, one of the other thugs swung a pistol, the heavy barrel catching Thomas squarely on the temple. He crumpled to the floor without a sound. Abigail's scream was a raw, tearing sound of pure agony. She rushed to her husband's side, but Kane grabbed her by the hair, yanking her back. He should have taken the offer, he grunted, his breath foul. "Now, we're just going to clear the lot." He threw her towards the back of the store and produced a can of kerosene. As his men began to douse the wooden shelves and floorboards, Abigail scrambled to Thomas's side. He was still breathing, a faint, shallow flutter. There was still hope. "Don't worry, Thomas," she sobbed, trying to drag him towards the door. "I'll get you out." But Kane stood in the doorway, a lit match in his hand. "This is the last time anyone will remember the name Finch in this town," he said. He tossed the match onto the kerosene-soaked floor. The world erupted in a roar of orange and yellow. The flames consumed the drywood with a terrifying hunger, leaping from the floor to the shelves, devouring their life's work in seconds. The heat was a physical blow, the smoke a choking, black poison. Abigail tried to shield Thomas's face, her own lungs screaming for air. Through the shimmering heat and smoke, she saw Kane's silhouette in the doorway, watching them burn. He stayed for a long moment, ensuring the job was done, before turning and disappearing into the street. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, Abigail managed to drag Thomas out the back door and into the alley just as the roof began to collapse. She beat at the small embers that had caught on his clothes, her hands raw, her mind a numb haze of horror. He was still alive. She had saved him. But the blow to his head had been too severe. He lay in the dust of the alley, his eyes fluttering open one last time. He looked at her, a flicker of recognition, of love, in their fading light. He tried to speak, but only a bloody sigh escaped his lips. And then, he was still. Abigail knelt there for an eternity, the heat of the burning store at her back, the growing crowd of onlookers a distant, meaningless buzz. She held Thomas's hand, feeling it grow cold in her own. The world had ended. The fire had taken everything. When the sun rose the next morning, it illuminated a scene of total devastation. The store was a blackened, smoldering skeleton. Their home, attached to the back, was gone. Everything they had built, everything they had loved, was reduced to ash and charcoal. Abigail stood in the center of the ruins. She was covered in soot, her dress torn, her hair singed. Her face was a pale, emotionless mask, but her eyes, which had once been the color of a warm summer sky, were now like chips of flint. They were cold, hard, and held a frightening new light. She looked at her hand, at the silver wedding band, now loose on her suddenly thin finger. The perfect circle was broken. She was no longer Mrs. Finch, the gentle shopkeeper. She was a widow, a survivor. She stood amidst the ashes of her life, not with the posture of a victim, but with the stillness of a predator that has just chosen its prey. The town of Tombstone saw a grieving woman. But in the heart of the ruins, a different woman was being born, forged in the fire of her loss and baptized in the ashes of her rage. In the days that followed, Tombstone offered its pity. It came in the form of covered dishes left on the doorstep of a neighbor who had taken Abigail in the somber, downward glances of men on the street, and in the hushed, sympathetic whispers of the town's women. They saw a poor, broken creature, a victim of the territory's brutal calculus. They offered her a future of quiet grief, of a life lived in the black weeds of widowhood, dependent on charity and faded memories. Abigail accepted their food, nodded at their condolences, and sat through their well-meaning visits with a terrifying stillness. She let their words wash over her, meaningless as the whisper of wind through the charred timbers of her former life. They could not see past the soot on her face to the inferno that was building behind her eyes. They were trying to comfort a woman who was already dead. The woman they had known, Abigail Finch, had died in the alley with her husband. The thing that remained was something else entirely. The town marshal, man with a stained mustache and shifty eyes, paid her a visit. He spoke of justice, of investigations, of bringing the men responsible to account. But his words were hollow, and his eyes wouldn't meet hers. She knew he was Thorne's man. She knew there would be no justice. He was just performing a part in a play for the town's benefit. "We will do everything in our power, Mum," he said, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. Abigail looked at him, her gaze so direct and empty that he flinched. "Your power," she said, her voice a dry and used rasp, "is worthless." She closed the door in his face, leaving him standing on the porch, a flush of anger and shame on his cheeks. That night, she returned to the ruins. The moon was a cold, silver eye in the sky, casting the blackened beams and piles of debris in skeletal relief. The air still smelled of smoke and sorrow. This was her ground zero, the place where her world had been unmade. She walked through the ashes, the fine gray powder clinging to the hem of her dark dress. She stopped at the spot where the front counter had been, where Thomas had made his stand. She knelt, her fingers sifting through the debris. They closed her on something hard and cool. She pulled it out. It was a small, ornate metal box, fire-blackened but intact. The cash box. Thomas had bolted it to the floorboards. She pried it open with a piece of scrap iron. Inside, and touched by the flames, was their life savings. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Enough for a new start, the town would have said. But Abigail wasn't thinking of a new start. She was thinking of an end. She found something else in the ashes of the workshop: Thomas's old star revolver, a relic from his brief time as a prospector before he had met her. He had kept it, oiled and wrapped in cloth, in a heavy tool chest. The chest was charred, but the gun inside was safe. She picked it up. It felt alien in her hand, heavy and cold and deadly. It was a tool of destruction, the opposite of everything Thomas had stood for. Now, it would be hers. She stood in the heart of the ruin, the gun in one hand, the box of money in the other, and she made her vow. It was not a loud, dramatic cry to the heavens. It was a whisper, a promise made to the ghosts and the ashes. Thomas, she breathed, the name a painful, sharp thing in her throat. They took you from me. They burned our life. They think I am broken. They think I am just a woman, a widow. She looked up at the cold, indifferent moon. I will not grieve. I will not weep. I will not fade away. I will become a fire. I will become the thing they should have feared more than any gun or any lawman. I will find them, Jedediah Cain, Cyrus Thorne, and every man who laughed while our world burned. Her voice grew stronger, each word a piece of steel being forged. I will hunt them. I will take their homes, their fortunes, their lives. I will turn their world to ash, just as they did mine. I swear this on your memory, my love. They lit the match. I will be the conflagration. She walked away from the ruins and did not look back. The next morning, she used a portion of the money to purchase a sturdy horse, a man's riding coat, or rifle, and several large tins of kerosene. She bought every box of matches in the 3 stores that sold them. The shopkeepers looked at her with curiosity and pity, assuming she was preparing for a long, lonely journey to start over somewhere else. They were right. She was starting over. She left Tombstone at dusk, a solitary figure riding not east towards the civilized world, but west, into the lawless and forgiving heart of the territory. She was leaving behind Abigail Finch and the life that had been stolen from her. She carried with her a gun she barely knew how to use, a burning hatred that was as pure and hot as a blacksmith's forge, and a vow that would set the whole territory ablaze. The widow of Tombstone had begun her hunt. The desert became her church, and the wind her only confidant. Abigail rode into the vast, sun-bleached wilderness and vanished. For the town of Tombstone, the grieving widow had simply moved on, another casualty of the frontier swallowed by the horizon. They would not have recognized the woman she was becoming. The first months were a brutal education in survival. The soft hands that had once measured fabric and kneaded dough became calloused and hard from handling a rifle and gathering firewood. She learned the harsh language of the desert, how to find water, how to read the tracks of animals, how to predict the weather from the color of the sky. She ate what she could hunt or forage, and slept with her back to a rock, the star revolver, a cold comfort, resting on her lap. The physical hardship was nothing compared to the transformation within. The grief that had threatened to drown her was a fuel she learned to control. She channeled it, focusing it into a singular, obsessive purpose. Every morning, she practiced with the revolver and the rifle. At first, her shots were wild, the kick of the weapons jarring her slight frame. But she was a patient student. She didn't practice for speed, she practiced for precision. She would set a tin can on a rock 100 yards away and fire, again and again, until she could hit it 5 times in a row. Her shoulder ached, her ears rang, but she did not stop. Thomas had been a builder, a man of precision, and she would honor him by making death an exact science. Her true weapon, however, was not the gun. It was fire. Fire was the agent of her unmaking, and it would be the agent of her revenge. She began to experiment with it, to learn its personality. She learned how a breeze could turn a spark into a blaze, how different materials burn fast, hot anger of dry grass, the slow, stubborn fury of seasoned wood. She learned how kerosene could be used to guide a flame, to create a wall of fire, to turn a wooden building into an inescapable inferno in minutes. In an abandoned line shack, she found old mining journals that spoke of dynamite and blasting caps. She studied them with the intensity of a scholar, learning the delicate art of destruction. Fire was her rage, but strategy would be her blade. She was not a brute like Cain, she would be a ghost, a whisper, a sudden and inescapable end. As a year bled into the next, she changed. She grew leaner, harder. The sun etched fine lines around her eyes and tanned her skin. The gentle grace of the shopkeeper was replaced by the coiled, watchful stillness of a predator. She no longer looked like Abigail Finch. When she caught her reflection in a still pool of water, she saw a stranger with old eyes looking back. Whispers began to filter out of the wilderness. A prospector would tell a story in a saloon of a silent woman in a dark coat who helped him fix a broken wagon wheel and then disappeared without a word. A group of outlaws, running from a posse, would be found a week later, not shot, but dead from thirst, their water canteens mysteriously punctured, their horses scattered. The legend began to take shape. They didn't have a name for her yet, but they spoke of a phantom of the high desert, a woman who moved like a shadow and seemed to be at home in the most unforgiving of places. She began to gather information. She would ride into the dusty outskirts of towns, her face obscured by her hat, and listen. She learned that Cyrus Thorne's empire was vast, a web of ranches, mines, and corrupt officials that stretched across the southern part of the territory. She learned that Jedediah Cain was his chief enforcer, a man who ruled by fear and brutality. She found her first target in a small, isolated town called Perdition. One of Thorne's lieutenants, a man named Marcus Slade, ran a freight company there that was a front for smuggling whiskey and guns. Slade was one of the men who had been there that day, who had laughed as her life burned. She remembered his face, the gap in his teeth. She watched the town for a week, her camp hidden high in the rocky hills above. She studied Slade's routine, the layout of his warehouse, the schedule of his guards. She was methodical, patient, cold. On a moonless night, she made her move. She didn't ride in with guns blazing. She crept into the town like a wisp of smoke. She silenced the 2 guards at the warehouse not with bullets, but with a garrote, a skill she had learned from a diagram in a discarded army manual. She was terrifyingly efficient. Inside the warehouse, she did not steal the guns or the whiskey. She moved through the stacks of crates, splashing kerosene from her tins, laying a trail. She worked with the calm precision of a craftsman, just as Thomas would have done. When she was finished, she stepped outside, walked 100 yards away, and took a position behind an outcropping of rock. She took out a single match from a waterproof tin. She struck it, the flare of the tiny flame bright in the oppressive darkness. It was the same sound she had heard in her store, the sound that had preceded the end of her world. For a moment, she saw Thomas's face in the flame, his kind eyes, his easy smile. A wave of pain, so sharp and profound it almost brought her to her knees, washed over her. The old Abigail, the woman who loved, screamed within her. This was the moment of her final, terrible choice, to let the flame die and ride away, or to let it live and become the monster they had made. Her hand trembled, but her resolve did not break. She thought of Cain's sneer, of Thomas's last, bloody sigh. Her eyes hardened. She tossed the match onto the kerosene-soaked porch. The result was an almost instantaneous explosion of light and heat. The fire roared to life, a hungry beast consuming the warehouse in a matter of seconds. The flames clawed at the night sky, turning it a sickening orange. Shouts of alarm rose from the town, but it was too late. The warehouse was a funeral pyre. As the townspeople gathered, staring in shock at the inferno, no one saw the lone figure in a long, dark coat watching from the hills. They did not see the fire reflected in her cold, dry eyes. The next morning, the smoldering ruins of the warehouse were the only topic of conversation. The marshal found the bodies of the guards, but no one could explain how the fire had started so quickly, so violently. But pinned to the warehouse's half-burnt sign was a single and burnt playing card, the Queen of Spades, the card of death. From that day on, the whispers had a name. They spoke of a woman who paid for wrongs not with bullets, but with fire. They spoke of an avenging angel cloaked in shadow and smelling of smoke. They called her the widow of Tombstone. Abigail Finch was gone forever. The flame had been given a name. Jedediah Cain was a man who lived by the simple creed of violence. He was Cyrus Thorne's fist, a blunt instrument sent to crush anything that stood in his master's way. After the successful end, to his mind, amusing destruction of Finch's provisions, he had been rewarded. Thorne had given him control of a remote ranching outpost in a box canyon, a front for Thorne's widespread rustling operations. It was a kingdom of dust, cattle, and brutal men, and Cain ruled it with casual cruelty. He thought of the fire in Tombstone with a smirk, the woman's scream a pleasant, fading memory. He never imagined that a memory could grow teeth. Abigail tracked him for 2 months. Her legend preceded her, a chilling whisper of fire and the Queen of Spades. Cain had heard the stories of the widow, but he was an arrogant man. He dismissed them as campfire tales, the fantasy of a territory spooked by its own shadows. He couldn't conceive that the sniveling shopkeeper's wife could be the ghost they spoke of. Abigail found his outpost nestled deep in the Dragoon Mountains. It was a natural fortress, with high canyon walls on 3 sides and a single, easily watched entrance. A direct assault would be suicide. But Abigail no longer thought in terms of direct assaults. She thought like a fire, seeking the smallest crack, the driest tinder, to begin her work. For a week, she lived on the canyon rim, a hawk circling its prey. She watched the patrols, the delivery of supplies, the way the men grew lazy and complacent in the afternoon heat. She saw Cain, a swaggering giant, moving among his men, his laughter a harsh, ugly sound that echoed off the rocks. Each time she heard it, the cold flame in her gut burned hotter. Her plan was one of patient, suffocating terror. It began with the water. The outpost's only reliable water source was a small stream that trickled down from the mountains. Under the cover of darkness, Abigail climbed high above the camp and found the source of the stream. Using rocks and packed earth, she didn't block it, she diverted it, sending the precious water trickling down a different, inaccessible rock face. It was a slow, quiet act of strangulation. Within 2 days, the stream in the camp had dwindled to a muddy trickle. The men grew thirsty, their tempers fraying in the relentless sun. They sent riders to find the blockage, but Abigail was waiting. From a sniper's perch, she didn't shoot the men, she shot their canteens, the bullets producing a small puff of dust and a spray of their precious water. The riders returned, spooked and empty-handed. Next, she targeted their food. The weekly supply wagon was their lifeline. Abigail found a narrow pass on its route. She didn't attack the wagon. The night before it was due, she set a controlled fire, not a raging inferno, but a slow, smoky blaze in the thick brush on either side of the pass. The driver, seeing the smoke and smelling the fire, would not risk passage. He turned back. The outpost was now cut off. No new supplies, and the water was nearly gone. The men began to fight amongst themselves. Cain's authority, built on brute force, began to crumble in the face of an enemy he couldn't see or punch. He sent more patrols out, but they found nothing. They were being hunted by a ghost. On the 5th night, Abigail decided it was time. The men were exhausted, dehydrated, and terrified. She began her descent into the canyon, a ghost in the moonlight. She moved to the large corral where they kept hundreds of stolen cattle. With a pair of wire cutters, she methodically cut the fence in 3 places. Then, from the darkness, she fired her rifle twice into the air and let out a piercing shriek that mimicked a mountain lion. The result was pandemonium. The thirsty, terrified cattle stampeded, pouring out of the broken corral and thundering through the camp. Men scrambled out of their bedrolls, disoriented and panicked. Tents were trampled, fires were scattered. In the midst of this chaos, Abigail moved, a silent angel of death. She used her knife on the first sentry, a garrote on the second. She moved toward the main ranch house where Cain was bunkered. As men ran past her in the darkness, she was just another shadow in the whirlwind of dust and bellowing cattle. She reached the ranch house. Through the window, she could see Cain roaring at his remaining men, his face purple with rage. She didn't go to the door. She went to the back, to the large store of kerosene they used for their lanterns. She smashed a window, tossed two lit, kerosene-soaked rags inside, and watched the storeroom erupt. The fire spread with terrifying speed, cutting off the back of the house. Cain and his last 3 men were trapped, forced out the front door into the moonlit yard. "Show yourself, you coward," Cain bellowed, firing his pistol into the shadows. Abigail's answer was a single rifle shot from the roof of the stable. One of his men crumpled to the ground. The other 2 broke and ran, disappearing into the darkness. Cain was alone. "I know it's you, bitch," he screamed, his voice raw with a mixture of rage and dawning horror as he finally understood. "You should have died in that fire. The fire set me free." Abigail's voice came from the darkness, cold and clear. She dropped from the stable roof, her revolver in her hand. She stood 50 feet from him, a slender silhouette against the backdrop of the burning house. Kane stared, his bravado finally cracking as he looked at the hard, implacable face of the woman he thought he had destroyed. This was not the sobbing victim from the store. This was something else entirely. He raised his pistol and fired. But his hands were shaking, his aim ruined by fear. Abigail stood her ground, calm and steady. She raised her star revolver, the weapon that should have been her husband's. She fired once. The bullet took Jedediah Kane in the chest. He staggered back, a look of utter disbelief on his face. He looked down at the dark stain spreading across his shirt, then back at her. He tried to speak, but only a choked gasp came out. He fell to his knees, and then pitched forward into the dust he had claimed as his kingdom. Abigail walked slowly toward him. She stood over his body, the heat of the fire on her face. She felt nothing. No triumph, no relief. Just the cold, quiet satisfaction of a debt paid. She reached into her coat, produced the Queen of Spades, and tucked it into the dead man's vest. She turned her back on the fire and the bodies and walked to the corral. She found a horse, saddled it, and rode out of the canyon, leaving the chaos and the flames behind. The second name on her list was crossed out. Her legend, now written in blood as well as fire, would spread. And Cyrus Thorne would know, without a doubt, that the ghost haunting his empire had a face. News of Jedediah Kane's death and the destruction of the rustling operation sent a shockwave through Cyrus Thorne's organization. A warehouse fire could be an accident. A dead enforcer in a burned-out, cattle-trampled canyon was a declaration of war. Thorne now knew who his enemy was, and the name Widow of Tombstone was no longer a campfire story. It was a direct threat to his life and his empire. Thorne reacted by tightening his grip. He recalled his men from outlying posts, fortifying his main holdings. He put a bounty on Abigail's head, a staggering sum that drew every low-life bounty hunter and desperate gunman from 3 territories. The hunter, for a time, became the hunted. Abigail felt the change immediately. She could no longer ride openly. Faces in every town watched her. Posters bearing a crude sketch of her face were nailed to every sheriff's office. She retreated deeper into the wilderness, melting into the landscape, using her hard-won survival skills to evade the posses and bounty hunters that swarmed the territory. Her next target was not a man, but the system that protected Thorne. The town of Silverton was Thorne's pocket. He owned the mine that was its lifeblood, and he owned its sheriff, a man named Barton. Sheriff Barton was the lawman who had ignored Abigail's initial pleas, the one who had declared Thomas's death a tragic accident with no one to blame. He was the grease on the gears of Thorne's corrupt machine. Abigail knew attacking Barton directly would be difficult. He surrounded himself with deputies and rarely left the brick-walled jailhouse. To destroy him, she had to destroy his authority and Thorne's hold on the town. She decided to steal the one thing Thorne and Barton valued more than anything, their money. Every Friday, the payroll for Thorne's many a heavy wagon full of cash and gold dust was brought into town and stored in the sheriff's supposedly impregnable safe overnight. Robbing it would not only be a financial blow to Thorne but would also make Sheriff Barton look like an incompetent fool. Abigail didn't plan a robbery, she planned a piece of theater. She spent 2 weeks in the hills above Silverton, not just watching, but preparing. She found an old, abandoned silver mine tunnel, its entrance hidden in a thicket of manzanita that old maps showed ran directly underneath the town's main street. The Friday of the payroll delivery, the whole town was on edge. Barton had doubled his deputies, posting them on rooftops and at the entrance to town, all looking for a woman in a dark coat. They were looking for a direct assault. They never thought to look down. That night, while Barton and his men drank coffee and stared into the darkness, Abigail was 30 feet below them. Using skills learned from old mining journals, she had spent the previous nights shoring up the old tunnel and calculating her position. She had a small charge of dynamite. Her target was not the sheriff's office, but the floor of the cell directly next to his office, where the safe stood. The explosion was not large, but it was deep and muffled. It was just enough to shatter the floorboards and foundation beneath the massive iron safe. To the deputies on the street, It sounded like a distant rumble of thunder. But inside the office, Sheriff Barton watched in horror as his floor buckled and the 2-ton safe, with a groan of tortured wood and stone, dropped out of sight into the earth. Before the dust had even settled, Abigail was there in the tunnel below. The safe had crashed through the tunnel roof, just as she had planned. It was dented but intact, waiting with a team of mules she had borrowed from Thorne's own stables. She and a few disgruntled miners she had secretly recruited, men whose claims had been stolen by Thorne, loaded the safe onto a heavy sled and dragged it deep into the mine tunnels. When the sun rose, Sheriff Barton had to face the town with an impossible story. His entire safe had vanished into a hole in the floor. Thorne was apoplectic. He rode into town himself, his face a mask of thunder. He publicly berated Barton, stripping him of his badge in the middle of the street. The sheriff's authority was shattered. Thorne had lost a fortune, and his control over Silverton was broken. But Abigail's act had an unintended consequence. During the chaos of the explosion, a stray piece of falling rock from the tunnel roof had struck one of her miner allies, injuring his leg badly. As she helped the man, his young son, a boy of 10, watched her with wide, terrified eyes. In his face, she saw not our gratitude, but fear. He was looking at the widow, the frightening legend, not a person. It was a crack in her armor of cold resolve. She had been so focused on her targets that she had started to see everyone else as pieces on a chessboard. This boy, his fear, reminded her of the cost. Her war was meant to be against monsters, but it was catching the innocent in its blast radius. She looked at her hands, covered in dirt and gunpowder residue. Were they the hands of a dispenser of justice, or just an agent of destruction? She made sure the injured miner and his family received a large share of the stolen payroll, enough for them to leave the territory and start a new, safe life. She left the rest of the money scattered in the pews of the town church, a donation to the people Thorne had been bleeding dry for years. On the door of the sheriff's office, she left the Queen of Spades. But this time, as she rode away, she wasn't thinking of her next target. She was thinking of the boy's eyes. The fire of her vengeance was pure, but she was beginning to understand that even the most righteous fire burns whatever it touches. The path of the widow was a lonely one, and for the first time, she felt the profound, biting chill of the ashes she was leaving in her wake. Cyrus Thorne was not a man who dirtied his own hands. Men like Cain were his fists, but men like Silas Cain were his mind. Cain was Thorne's architect of ruin, a lawyer and land agent based in the territorial capital of Prescott. He was a man of quiet suits, polished shoes, and whispered words that could dispossess a family of their land more effectively than any gun. It was Cain who had found the legal loopholes to challenge Thomas Finch's deed, Cain who had drawn up the fraudulent papers, and Cain who had advised Thorne that a more direct approach would be the quickest solution. He was the serpent in the garden, the man whose ink-stained fingers were as bloody as Jedediah Cain's. Abigail knew that killing this man would be different. Cain was surrounded not by thugs in a dusty canyon, but by the walls of civilization, by lawmen, and by the polite society he expertly navigated. To get to him, the widow of Tombstone couldn't use a rifle from a dusty ridge. Abigail Finch would have to be reborn. She sold the gold and cash she'd taken from the Silverton safe, laundering it through a dozen different channels until it was clean money. She then arrived in Prescott not as a ghost, but as a lady. Mrs. Evelyn Hayes, a supposed widow from San Francisco, recently come into an inheritance, looking for a quiet place to live and perhaps make some sound investments. She dressed in fine, modest black, her hair pinned up neatly, her face veiled. She carried no weapons, only a small lady's handbag and an air of quiet, unshakable grief that was all too easy for her to fake. She took a small, respectable house and began to carefully weave herself into the fabric of Prescott society. She attended church socials, donated to civic causes, and spoke with a soft, cultured voice. And she made it known, through carefully placed whispers, that she was looking for a man to manage her considerable finances, a man of discretion and vision. Every whisper, every gesture, was a lure. Silas Cain, whose ambition was matched only by his greed, soon heard of the mysterious, wealthy widow. He saw an opportunity too great to ignore. He arranged an introduction. Meeting him for the first time was the greatest test of Abigail's control. He was a small, neat man with thinning hair and pale, intelligent eyes. He smelled of bayrum and money. As he bowed over her hand, she had to fight the primal urge to claw his eyes out. Instead, she smiled, a sad, gentle smile. "A pleasure, Mr. Kane." For weeks, she played the part of the naive, grieving woman, allowing him to court her, not romantically, but as a business partner. She let him advise her, feigning ignorance of financial matters. He spoke of investments, of land, of opportunities. And as he grew more comfortable, more arrogant in his belief that he had found the perfect mark, he began to speak of his greatest client, the brilliant Cyrus Thorne. He boasted of their successes, their methods, the clever ways they had consolidated power. Abigail listened, her mind a cold, calculating machine, filing away every detail, every name, every location. She was a spider, patiently spinning a web, and Kane was wrapping himself in it with every boastful word. The real prize was in his office, the ledgers and deeds that were the paper heart of Thorne's empire. She knew she could never break in. She had to be invited. One evening, working late, he invited her to his office to sign some papers for a land purchase she was making under his guidance. It was the moment she had been waiting for. While he poured them both a glass of sherry, she accidentally knocked a stack of papers from his desk. As they both knelt to pick them up, she palmed a small, blank ledger book, identical to the ones on his shelf, from a hidden pocket in her dress, and swapped it with the one containing the details of Thorne's Tombstone operations. It was a move of breathtaking audacity, practiced 100 times in her small house. He never noticed. Later that night, long after she had left his office, she sat in her rented house and opened the real ledger. There it was, in Kane's meticulous script, the proof of everything. The legal land grabs, the bribery payments to officials, the notes detailing the removal of obstacles. There, on one page, was a single, chilling entry, Tombstone Corner Lotfinch. Obstacle removed. Final payment to J. Kane. She had what she needed. But simply exposing him was not enough. He was an architect of ruin. She would make him the architect of his own. She used the information in the ledger to write a series of anonymous letters. One went to a federal marshal known for his incorruptible nature, detailing Thorne's bribery of territorial officials. Another went to a rival land baron, providing proof that Kane had been systematically cheating him on behalf of Thorne. A third, detailing Kane's role in the Finch murder, she sent to the editor of the most muckraking newspaper in the territory. She laid the kindling for a dozen different fires. Her final act was for Kane himself. The next day, he was found in his office, dead from a single, expertly placed throwing knife to the back of the neck. The authorities were baffled. There was no sign of forced entry, but on his desk, laid open to the page detailing the Finch payment, was his own ledger, and resting on the page was the Queen of Spades. The day after Kane's body was discovered, the newspaper story broke. The federal marshal arrived with warrants. The rival land barons started a violent range war against Thorne's northern holdings. Silas Kane's carefully constructed world of paper and whispers collapsed in on itself, and it pulled a cornerstone out of Cyrus Thorne's empire. In Prescott, they whispered that the wealthy Mrs. Hayes had been so distraught by the scandal that she had packed her bags and left town overnight. They never connected the quiet, grieving widow with the deadly, avenging one. Abigail rode out of Prescott, her disguise shed, leaving behind a firestorm of lawsuits, investigations, and range wars. She hadn't needed a single match. She had made the serpent devour itself. The fall of Silas Kane was a mortal blow. Thorne had lost his muscle, his law, and now his mind. His empire, which had once seemed as vast and immovable as the mountains, was now bleeding from a dozen wounds. The range war in the north drained his resources, the federal investigation choked his political influence, and the legend of the widow, now more terrifying than ever, eroded the loyalty of his men. The bounty on her head remained unclaimed. No one wanted to hunt a ghost who could topple men in power with a whisper and a playing card. Thorne was cornered, his back to the wall. And it was then that he proved he was at his most dangerous. He knew Abigail would not stop until one of them was in the ground. He could no longer wait for her to come to him. He had to force her hand, to draw her out of the shadows and onto a battlefield of his own choosing. He needed bait so personal, so sacred to her, that she would have no choice but to take it, even if she knew it was a trap. He returned to Tombstone, the place where it all began, and he sent out an announcement that was published in every newspaper in the territory. Cyrus Thorne, as a gesture of civic progress, was finally beginning construction on his grand project, a magnificent hotel and saloon, the finest west of the Mississippi. It would be called the Phoenix, a symbol of the town's ability to rise from its own ashes into a new era of prosperity. The groundbreaking ceremony was to be held in 2 weeks. On the corner of Allen Street, on the exact spot where Finch's Provisions had once stood. The newspaper found its way to Abigail in a small cantina in New Mexico. As she read the words, the cold, controlled fire within her roared into a white-hot inferno. The Phoenix, the sheer, monstrous arrogance of it, the deliberate, cruel mockery of her and Thomas's memory, was a slap in the face she could feel across 100 miles. She knew it was a trap. Tombstone would be an armed camp. Every remaining gunman loyal to Thorne would be there, waiting for her on every rooftop, in every alley. It was a suicide mission. The cold, strategic part of her brain, the part that had outwitted Silas Kane, screamed at her to ignore it, to let him have his empty gesture, to strike him somewhere else, somewhere unexpected. But the other part of her, the part that still knelt in the ashes of her life, knew she had to go. That piece of ground was not just a corner lot. It was her home. It was the last tangible piece of her life with Thomas. To allow Thorne to build a monument to his own greed on top of it, to name it with such a vicious irony, was a desecration she could not permit. This was never just about killing Thorne. It was about erasing the stain of his existence. And that stain was now concentrated on that one patch of dirt. Her journey back to Tombstone was a pilgrimage into her own past. With every mile, the memories grew stronger. She saw Thomas's face in the passing landscape, heard his laughter on the wind. The cold, hard shell of the widow began to crack, revealing the still grieving woman beneath. Was this vengeance, or was it just an elaborate, bloody form of suicide? Had she become so consumed by the fire that the only way to put it out was to walk directly into the heart of the blaze? She didn't know the answer. She only knew she had to ride on. She slipped into Tombstone a week before the ceremony, not as a lady or a ghost, but as something less than a shadow. She came in on foot, at night, dressed as a broke prospector. The town she found was not the home she remembered. It was an occupied territory. Thorne's men were everywhere, their rifles and hard eyes a constant, oppressive presence. The townspeople moved with their heads down, their fear a palpable thing in the air. Her town was a prisoner, and she had come to burn the prison down. Abigail didn't see a town full of enemies, she saw a chessboard. Thorne had positioned his pieces, his gunmen, like towers and knights, confident in their power. But he had forgotten about the pawns. The ordinary people of Tombstone he had terrorized, and he had completely underestimated the Queen. Abigail's first move was to find an ally. She went to the blacksmith shop at the edge of town, run by a gnarled, elderly man named Ezra, who had been Thomas's closest friend. Ezra's face, when he recognized her beneath the dirt and the prospector's rags, was a mask of shock and grief. "Abigail, by God, we all thought you were dead," he whispered, pulling her into the sweltering darkness of the smithy. "The best parts of me are, Ezra," she said, her voice rough. "I need your help. Not to fight, to prepare." Ezra, who had hated Thorne with a silent, simmering passion since the day of the fire, agreed without hesitation. His smithy became her secret base of operations. While the town slept, he forged for her, not weapons, but tools, specialized hooks, wire cutters, and small, powerful levers. And he gave her information, telling her which of Thorne's men were billeted where, which buildings he had taken over. With Ezra's help, Abigail became the ghost of Allen Street. Her war began not with fire, but with fear. She used the legend she had become as her primary weapon. One of Thorne's top lieutenants woke to find the Queen of Spades pinned to his door with a Bowie knife. A patrol guarding Thorne's new headquarters found their ammunition pouches sliced open, their bullets spilled into the dust. The ropes on the main flagpole were cut, and in the morning, Thorne's personal banner was found lying in a horse trough. These were small acts, but they were inexplicable. They created an atmosphere of deep, unnerving dread. Thorne's men, already on edge waiting for an attack, began to unravel. They were hired guns, motivated by money, not loyalty. They had signed up to fight a woman, not a phantom who could walk through walls and steal the bullets from their belts. They started drinking more, fighting amongst themselves, seeing the widow's shadow in every corner. Thorn was enraged. He doubled the patrols, offered bonuses for any information, and even had a few townsfolk publicly whipped for collaboration. But his brutality only served to turn the town's silent fear into simmering hatred, pushing more people to secretly help Abigail. The baker would leave a loaf of bread for her in a prearranged spot. The stable boy would accidentally leave a stall unlocked. Abigail, meanwhile, was preparing her final act. She wasn't just planning to stop the ceremony, she was planning to perform an exorcism. Using the old town blueprints Thomas had kept, and her own intimate knowledge of the buildings, she identified the 3 pillars of Thorn's power in Tombstone: the Grand Hotel, where he housed his men; the SE office, where he stored his wealth; and the livery, where he kept the horses that gave his men their mobility. For 3 nights, she moved through the town's secrets, possessed forgotten cellars, the narrow gaps between buildings, the rickety rooftops. She was a phantom on a grim errand. Into each of the 3 key buildings, she planted her seeds of destruction, tins of kerosene hidden in dark corners, connected by carefully laid trails of oil-soaked rags that snaked through the walls and under the floorboards, all leading to a single, accessible point outside each building. She was turning Thorn's own assets into a massive, interconnected funeral pyre. She was rigging the chessboard to burn. On the final night before the ceremony, she stood on the hill overlooking the town. The lights of the saloons cast a sickly yellow glow. She could feel the tension below, a spring coiled so tight it had to break. Tomorrow, Thorn expected a gunfight. He expected a sniper on a roof or a bomb under the platform. He was a man of violence, and he could only imagine a violent response. He had no idea that she wasn't coming to fight him. She was coming to unmake his world, just as he had unmade hers. She held a single match in her hand, its red tip a promise of the dawn to come. The morning of the ceremony dawned bright and brittle, the sky a hard, cloudless blue. A stage had been built on the ashes of Abigail's life, draped in red, white, and blue bunting. An expectant crowd of townspeople, their faces a mixture of curiosity and fear, was herded into the street by Thorn's men. The gunmen were everywhere, perched on rooftops like vultures, their rifles glinting in the sun. It was high noon in a town holding its breath. Cyrus Thorn stepped onto the stage, preening in a fine suit, a symbol of absolute power. He raised his hands for silence, a smug, triumphant smile on his face. He began to speak, his voice booming across the street, words of progress and prosperity, lies as hollow as a drum. Abigail was not on a rooftop. She was in the crowd, a shawl over her head, her face bowed as if in prayer. No one noticed her. They were all looking at the devil on the stage. As Thorn reached the crescendo of his speech, preparing to plunge a silver shovel into the ground, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A woman in the crowd was walking forward, slowly, deliberately. She threw back her shawl. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was her, the widow of Tombstone, the legend made flesh. Thorn's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of snarling hatred. "Get her," he roared, pointing a trembling finger. His men raised their rifles. The crowd screamed and scattered, a human tide parting before her. For a moment, she stood alone in the empty street, facing down to dozen guns. "It's over, Thorn," she called out, her voice clear and steady. "Your time in Tombstone is done." "My time is just beginning," he shrieked. Kill her now." But before the first shot could be fired, a deep, resonant boom echoed from the far end of town. All heads turned. A thick column of black smoke was pouring from the Grand Hotel. Abigail had not acted alone. Ezra the blacksmith and a handful of other trusted townsfolk, then Thomas had called friends, were her timers. At her signal, the dropping of her shawl had lit the fuses. A second boom followed, this one from the direction of the SE office. Then a third, from the livery. Within a minute, the 3 pillars of Thorn's power were erupting in flame, a coordinated, catastrophic assault. The gunmen on the rooftops faltered, their attention torn. Their barracks were burning, their money was burning, their horses were trapped. Their loyalty, paid for in coin, evaporated in the face of the inferno. Several of them dropped their rifles and ran, desperate to save their own skins and possessions. The trap had collapsed from the inside out. In the chaos, Abigail drew her star revolver. She fired not at Thorn, but at the fancy silver shovel leaning against the stage. The bullet sent it spinning into the dirt. Thorn, his face a mask of disbelief as he watched his empire burn, finally drew his own weapon. The duel was not a classic standoff. It was a chaotic, desperate exchange of fire amidst the smoke and screams. Thorn was a rich man, not a gunfighter. His shots were wild. Abigail was a woman forged in purpose. Her shots were deliberate. One bullet tore through his shoulder, spinning him round. Another took him in the leg, sending him crashing from the stage into the dirt of the life he had destroyed. He lay there, wounded and broken, his fine suit covered in ash and dust, his empire a raging funeral pyre behind him. Abigail walked toward him, her revolver steady. She stood over him, the man who had taken everything from her. His men were gone. His wealth was burning. He was nothing. Please, he rasped, looking up at her, all the arrogance gone, replaced by a pathetic, animal fear. Mercy. She looked down at him, her face unreadable. Here it was. The moment she had lived for. The culmination of her long, dark journey. She could pull the trigger and end it, completing the circle of violence. She could become the monster he had made her. The heat of the fires washed over her face. She saw Thomas's face in her mind, not his dying gasp, but his gentle smile. He was a builder, not a destroyer. She lowered the gun. My husband was a good man, she said, her voice quiet but carrying over the roar of the flames. He deserved better than a killer for a wife. You can die in the ashes of your own greed. She turned her back on him and walked away, not looking back. She left him to the judgment of the fire, or to the justice of the townspeople, who were now emerging from their homes, their fear replaced by a righteous fury. Abigail walked through the inferno she had created, a ghost passing through her own judgment day. The fires were not a wild, chaotic rage, but a cleansing. They were devouring the cancer that had infected her town, burning away the corruption, the fear, the memory of Cyrus Thorn. The people of Tombstone, freed from their prison, would rebuild. They would rise from these ashes, truly like a phoenix. But she could not be one of them. She found Ezra by the blacksmith shop, his old face grim but triumphant in the firelight. "It is done," he said. "It is," she replied. She pressed a heavy pouch of coins into his hand, her share of the money from the Silverton safe. For the town. To rebuild. He tried to refuse, but she was insistent. Thomas would have wanted it. "Build something good, Ezra. Build something that lasts." She walked to the edge of town where she had left her horse. She mounted up and took one last look at the burning town. It was no longer her home. It was a pyre, and she had been its priestess. Her vow was fulfilled. Thorn was broken, his empire was ash, and Thomas was avenged. But the victory was hollow, leaving behind only an ocean of exhaustion. She rode out into the desert, into the cool darkness of the night. She rode until the red glow of Tombstone was just a faint smudge on the horizon. She came to a small, clear stream, shimmering in the pre-dawn light. She dismounted, her movements stiff and weary. She knelt by the water and looked at her reflection. She saw the face of a stranger, a woman with eyes as old as the mountains, her features etched with grief and violence. She saw the widow of Tombstone. But for the first time in years, she looked deeper, and she saw a flicker of someone else. A woman who had once known how to smile. A survivor. She reached into the pocket of her long, dark coat. She took out the last of her weapons. Not the gun, but the two things that had defined her transformation. A single, unused wooden match, and her last playing card, the Queen of Spades. They were the symbols of her rage, the tools of her vengeance. She held them in her palm for a long moment. Then, with a quiet finality, she opened her hand and let them drop into the stream. They floated on the surface for a moment before the current caught them, pulling them away, carrying them downriver into the darkness. She watched until they were gone. She was letting the widow go, setting the ghost free. Her future was a blank, handwritten page. She didn't know where she would go or who she would become. But as she mounted her horse and turned its head away from the dying embers of her past, she wasn't riding into the sunset. She was riding toward the faint, gray promise of the dawn. The legend of the widow would be told around campfires for 100 years, a tale of fire and fury. But the woman, Abigail, was finally, blessedly, at peace.